Welcome back. Close the door. Lock it if you can. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't the kind of thing you want drifting into the wrong ears. These are real accounts. Real people. Real fear. And they all share one terrifying detail in common. At some point, these men and women came home, looked around their living space, and realized with a cold, crawling certainty that the most dangerous thing in their world wasn't outside. It was already inside. Already sleeping in the next room. Already breathing the same air. Already watching them. We talk a lot about strangers as the source of danger. We teach our children about them. We install locks on our doors to keep them out. We build fences, security systems, alarm codes, all of it designed to protect us from the threat we imagine lurking somewhere out there in the dark. But here's the question I want you to sit with for a moment. What happens when the threat already has a key? Roommate situations have existed for as long as humans have needed to share resources. Students cramming into tiny apartments. Young professionals splitting rent in cities that cost more than their paychecks. Strangers matched by online platforms and mutual desperation. It's ordinary. It's practical. Millions of people do it every single day without incident. But underneath that ordinary arrangement lives something that psychologists, criminologists, and true crime researchers have been quietly circling for decades. The forced intimacy of shared living creates one of the most psychologically volatile environments a human being can occupy. You sleep near someone you may barely know. You share your bathroom, your kitchen, your quiet hours, your private routines. You lower your guard because the door is locked and the face on the other side of it is, technically, someone you agreed to live with. And that, right there, that moment of lowered guard, is exactly where these stories begin. So ask yourself this. How well do you really know the person sleeping on the other side of your wall tonight? Do you know where they go when they leave at 2 in the morning and come back without speaking? Do you know what they're thinking when the apartment goes quiet and the lights go out? Because the people in these stories didn't know either. And that unknowing cost them everything. Let's begin. The first story comes from a college town in the Pacific Northwest. Gray skies. Perpetual rain. One of those places where the weather itself feels like a warning that nobody listens to. The kind of place where the trees are so tall and so dense that midday light barely reaches the ground, and the fog rolls in off the water every morning like it's reclaiming something it lost. Her name was Mireille. She was 22 years old, a third-year environmental science student who had transferred from a school in the Midwest after what she described to her mother as needing a change of pace and scenery. She was quiet, precise, methodical. The kind of person who color-coded her study notes and kept a detailed calendar on the wall above her desk. She liked routine. She found comfort in predictability, which is important because what happened to her started as a slow, systematic destruction of every predictable thing she thought she knew. Mireille had found her roommate through an off-campus housing board. The listing had been detailed, almost reassuringly so. The apartment was a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house that had been split into units sometime in the 80s. Original hardwood floors. Bay windows. A clawfoot tub in the bathroom that Mireille had thought was charming when she first visited. The rent was divided evenly. The listing said the current tenant, a woman named Delphine, was a graduate student in clinical psychology. Quiet, organized, looking for someone who respected personal space. They met once before Mireille moved in. Coffee in a campus cafe. Delphine was in her late 20s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an unsettling habit of maintaining eye contact just a few seconds longer than felt comfortable. But she was articulate, thoughtful, and seemed genuinely interested in Mireille's research on soil erosion in temperate forests. Mireille thought she seemed a little intense, but interesting. Intelligent people were often a little intense. She signed the sublease agreement that same afternoon. The first month was unremarkable. Delphine was quiet. She kept strange hours, sometimes not coming home until well past midnight, sometimes not leaving at all for days. But she was clean, she paid her share of the utilities promptly, and she respected Mireille's study hours without being asked. Mireille sent a text to her mother saying that the situation seemed promising. That was in October. By November, Mireille started noticing small things. Not alarming things. Just small. The kind of things you initially file under personal quirks or coincidence because the alternative, that something is actually wrong, is too uncomfortable to entertain. The first thing she noticed was that objects in her room were being moved. Not dramatically. Not furniture. Small things. Her stapler, which she always kept in the upper right corner of her desk, was sometimes in the upper left. A stack of books she had arranged in a specific order would occasionally arrive back in a slightly different configuration. Her toothbrush, which she kept on the left side of the bathroom cup, was sometimes on the right when she came home. Nothing dramatic. Just small enough that she chalked it up to her own absent-mindedness. After all, she was carrying a heavy academic load. She was probably just forgetting where she'd put things. But here is the thing about that kind of experience, and this is something behavioral psychologists call ambient reality distortion, and it is one of the most insidiously effective tools that a manipulative person can use. When you begin to doubt your own memory about small things, you start to doubt your perception generally. You become less confident in your own experience of reality. And a person who is less confident in their own experience of reality is a person who is much less likely to trust their own instincts when something genuinely dangerous begins to happen. Mireille kept a journal. It was a habit she'd had since she was 14, a plain black hardcover notebook that she kept in the second drawer of her nightstand. She didn't write in it every day, but often enough that it reflected her mental state in a fairly continuous way. In early November, her entries were normal. Classes. Research notes. A complaint about the price of groceries. A description of a particularly beautiful fog-covered morning she'd seen from the bay window. But then, around the second week of November, something in her entries shifted. She started writing about the feeling of being watched. Not by anything specific. Just the feeling. She wrote, "I keep catching myself checking over my shoulder in my own apartment, which is ridiculous, but I can't seem to stop." She wrote about waking at 3 in the morning to the sound of movement in the hallway outside her bedroom door, and lying completely still in the dark, listening, until the sound stopped. She wrote, "I asked Delphine if she'd been up last night, and she looked at me for a long time before she said no. Just no. And then she smiled and went back to her reading." That smile showed up in Mireille's journal 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. Each time described identically. A slow smile that started in the eyes before it reached the mouth. A smile that Mireille struggled to define but wrote about as feeling like the smile of someone who knows something you don't. Here is where the story shifts. Here is the moment that turned this from a vague sense of unease into something that Mireille later described as the moment her mind stopped being able to explain things away. It was a Thursday night in late November. Mireille had come home from the library later than usual, around 11:30. The apartment was dark when she came in, which meant Delphine was either out or already in bed. Mireille moved quietly through the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and went to her room. She set her bag down. She sat on the edge of her bed and reached into her nightstand drawer for her journal, intending to write before sleeping. The journal was there. But it was not the way she had left it. Mireille was very specific about this when she later recounted the experience. She kept the journal face down in the drawer, spine facing the back of the drawer. It was now face up, spine facing the front. Someone had taken it out and put it back. And when she opened it, she found something that made her hand go cold against the pages. On a page near the middle of the journal, one of her own entries had been underlined. Just one sentence. The sentence read, "Sometimes I think she can see through walls." The underlining was done in a different pen than the one she used. blue ballpoint where hers was always black. And beside the underlined sentence, written in the margin in small, precise handwriting that was not hers, were 2 words. I can. Mireille sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after reading that. She told the friend she eventually confided in that she couldn't move. Not out of paralysis exactly, but something more like the sensation of the floor not being as solid as she had always assumed it was. Her brain kept insisting there was an explanation. That she had written it herself in a fugue state. That she had used a different pen once and forgotten. That she was cracking under academic pressure and imagining things. But the handwriting was not hers. She knew her own handwriting with the certainty of someone who had been writing in journals since the age of 14. The handwriting in the margin was someone else's. She did not confront Delphine that night. I want you to sit with that for a moment and ask yourself what you would have done. Because most people, when they hear this story, immediately say, I would have confronted her right then. I would have packed my bag. I would have called someone. But Mireille did none of those things that night, and before you judge her for it, consider that she had been living in a low-grade state of self-doubt for over a month. She had been slowly trained not to trust her own perceptions. And the person who had done that training was sleeping in the next room. The same person she would have had to walk past to leave. The same person she would have had to stand in front of and accuse, alone, in an apartment that had thick Victorian walls and windows that looked out onto an empty street in the middle of the night. She locked her bedroom door. She pushed her desk chair under the doorknob. She sat on her bed with a journal in her lap and didn't sleep at all. In the morning, she called her friend Ondine, a fellow student who lived in a campus dormitory. She described what she'd found. Ondine came over that afternoon while Delphine was out. She read the journal entry. She looked at the handwriting in the margin. And she told Mireille to get out that week. But here is where the story takes a turn that many people find more disturbing than the journal itself. Because when Mireille began, quietly and carefully, to plan her exit, she discovered things about Delphine that reframed every moment she had spent in that apartment. She started, on Ondine's suggestion, doing what the internet made it possible to do. She searched Delphine's full name. Graduate student in clinical psychology. The name she had been given when she signed the sublease. And what she found was not nothing. It was not a blank page. What she found was a post on a university housing forum from 18 months earlier, written by a woman who described herself as a former roommate of someone named Delphine in another city. A different university. The post was long and detailed and had been partly deleted, but enough remained to paint a picture that was recognizable. The writer described coming home to find her belongings subtly rearranged. She described waking to sounds in the hallway. She described a specific incident involving her own private writing, a letter she had been drafting to her mother, which had been moved and, she was certain, read. And she described something else. Something that Mireille read twice because she could not immediately process it. The former roommate described finding, in a space above the drop ceiling of the bathroom that she had only discovered when a tile came loose, a small collection of objects that belonged to her. Not valuable things. A hair tie. A torn envelope with her name on it. A receipt from a grocery store. A photograph she had thought she'd lost. All of them collected. All of them stored above the ceiling of a room they shared. Now I want you to think about what that means for a moment. Not just the act itself, though the act is deeply disturbing. Think about what it reveals about the person who did it. This is not impulsive behavior. This is not the act of someone temporarily unbalanced or acting out in a moment of conflict. This is patient, deliberate, sustained collection. This is someone who has decided that you belong to them in some way that you have not consented to and cannot see. Forensic psychologists have a term for this kind of behavior in the context of cohabitation. They call it intrusive possession, and it exists on a spectrum that, at its most severe, has preceded some of the most disturbing domestic crimes in documented criminal history. Mireille showed Ondine the forum post. They both sat in silence for a moment. Then Mireille noticed something else in the post. A detail that the writer had included almost as an aside, almost as if she herself wasn't sure it was relevant. She described Delphine's eyes. Specifically, she described the way Delphine would look at her sometimes when she thought when she thought the roommate wasn't looking. She described it as like being studied, like being a specimen, like existing, in someone else's perception, as a subject rather than a person. Mireille closed her laptop and said to Ondine, "I need to check something." She went to the bathroom. She closed the door behind her. She stood in the center of the floor and looked up at the ceiling tiles. They were original to the Victorian building, old pressed fiber tiles that had yellowed slightly over the decades. She reached up and pressed against one of them near the corner farthest from the door. It moved. She didn't lift it. She told Ondine later that she pushed it with one finger and felt it shift, felt it give in a way that told her it had been moved before. Recently. More than once. And she stopped. She put her hand down. She walked out of the bathroom. She looked at Ondine and said, "We need to go right now." They left. They took Mireille's laptop, her journal, her most important documents, and her phone charger. They went to Ondine's dormitory and Mireille filed a report with both campus housing and the local non-emergency police line the next morning. The police did eventually go to the apartment to conduct what they called a wellness check and a follow-up on the reported harassment. What they found in the bathroom ceiling space was never fully disclosed publicly. Mireille was told only that the report had been referred to a further unit and that she should seek alternative housing, which she did. Delphine was removed from the apartment within the week. What Mireille thinks about most, even years later, is not the journal. It's not even the ceiling. It's the smile. The specific smile that she had written about in her journal 3 times before everything fell apart. The smile that said, "I know something you don't." Because Mireille now understands what Delphine knew. She knew what was above the bathroom ceiling. She knew what she had read in the journal. She knew exactly how deeply she had already invaded the life of the woman sleeping on the other side of the wall. And she smiled about it in the morning over coffee while Mireille poured cereal and thought she was imagining things. The most terrifying thing about Delphine was not that she was dangerous. The most terrifying thing was that she was patient. Let's pause for a second, because I want you to think about your own living situation. Maybe you have a roommate right now. Maybe you had one in the past. Ask yourself, did they ever return your smile in a way that felt just slightly off? Did you ever find something in a different place than where you left it and tell yourself you were just being forgetful? Did you ever wake in the night to a sound you couldn't explain and talk yourself back to sleep because the alternative was too uncomfortable to sit with? I'm not trying to make you paranoid. I'm trying to make you honest. Because the people in these stories were not naive. They were not foolish. They were ordinary people who did what ordinary people do. They gave someone the benefit of the doubt, and then they gave it again and again until the doubt had accumulated into something that could no longer be explained away. The second story is different in almost every way. Different geography, different psychology, different kind of fear. Because if the first story is about a threat that operates in silence and shadow, this second story is about something louder. Something that made itself known gradually, then all at once, in the way that the worst things always do. The setting is an apartment building in a mid-sized industrial city in the Midwest. Late winter. The kind of cold that gets under your coat and stays there. Streets that empty out after dark not because of any particular danger but because there is simply nothing to stay outside for. The kind of city that keeps its head down and its curtains closed. His name was Cashin. He was 29 years old, recently separated from his long-term partner, recently relocated to a city he didn't know well for a job in logistics management that had seemed, at the time, like exactly the kind of fresh start he needed. He found his apartment through a company that managed several buildings in the area and was told that a 2-bedroom unit was available in one of their newer renovated properties. There was already one occupant on the lease, a man named Tolliver, who had been living there for about a year and who the management company described as quiet and employed and without any flags in his tenant history. Cashin met Tolliver before moving in. They shook hands in the parking lot of the building. Tolliver was compact and physically fit, with close-cropped hair and a stillness about him that Cashin interpreted, at the time, as calm. He was friendly in a minimal way. He answered Cashin's questions about the neighborhood, the building rules, the parking situation, the laundry schedule. He smiled appropriately. He seemed, to use the word that Cashin would later return to with profound irony, normal. Cashin moved in on a Saturday in February. He spent his first night there unpacking boxes while snow fell against the window and the radiator clicked and hissed in a rhythm that he told himself he would get used to. Tolliver was in his room. The door was closed. There was no sound from behind it, which Cashin noted and filed under good sign. The first weeks were comfortable, or at least livable. Tolliver kept to himself in a way that bordered on invisible. He worked days, came home in the early evenings, cooked something in the kitchen, and retreated to his room. The apartment was clean. The shared spaces were respected. Cashin began to feel, tentatively, like the arrangement was going to work. He called his mother on a Sunday afternoon and told her that his roommate was quiet and that the apartment was fine and that everything was going to be okay. He believes now that Tolliver heard that phone call. The apartment walls were thin. He believes that because of what he discovered much later. But we'll get there. The first sign of something wrong was not threatening. It was, in fact, almost laughably mundane. Cashin noticed that food was disappearing from the refrigerator. Not conspicuously. Not in a way that would constitute theft by any ordinary measure. A yogurt he was fairly sure he'd had 2 days before would be gone, replaced with a different yogurt that he didn't remember buying. An apple would be missing and an apple would be in its place, but it would be a different variety. Small substitutions. Small disappearances. He mentioned it to Tolliver, carefully, expecting an awkward but explainable conversation about accidentally eating the wrong thing. Tolliver listened to him, face absolutely neutral, and said, "I haven't touched your food, Cashin." And then he went back to his room. The neutrality was the strange part. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Not even particularly interested. Just neutral, in the way that you might be neutral about something that has no bearing on you whatsoever. Like he was reporting information rather than participating in a conversation. The food thing continued. And then something else started, something that was harder for Cashin to articulate, but that began to genuinely disturb him. Tolliver started anticipating him. Small things at first. Tolliver would finish in the bathroom and come out just before Cashin arrived in the hallway on his way there, as if he had timed it. Tolliver would come to the kitchen within 2 or 3 minutes of Cashin starting to cook, not always saying anything, just being there, appearing at the edge of the space. When Cashin came home in the evenings, he would sometimes hear Tolliver's bedroom door open within 30 seconds of the front door closing, even when Cashin had come home at an unusual time, a different hour than his typical routine. It was as if Tolliver always knew exactly when Cashin was there. Cashin started testing it. He would come home at random times. He would move through the apartment without a particular pattern, starting tasks and stopping them and switching rooms. He would go quiet for long stretches to see what happened. And almost always, within a predictable window, he would become aware of Tolliver. Not directly, not confrontationally, just a presence at the edge of his awareness. A door movement, a shift in the air of the apartment, a sound from the other side of a wall. Cashin told a co-worker about this. The co-worker, a pragmatic and grounded man named Pharaoh, told him he was probably just becoming hyper-aware of his roommate's patterns because he was alone in a new city and his anxiety was running high. Which was a reasonable thing to say. It might even have been true, at least partially. But then February turned to March, and something happened that was not, by any reasonable interpretation, explainable by anxiety. Cashin worked from home one Friday. He didn't tell Tolliver he was going to be in the apartment all day because he had no particular reason to. He set up his laptop in the kitchen, made coffee, and settled in for a day of spreadsheets and conference calls. Tolliver left for work at the usual time. Cashin heard the front door close. He heard the elevator down the hall. He went back to his laptop. About 4 hours later, during a lull between calls, Cashin got up to refill his coffee and paused in the kitchen doorway. Something was different in the apartment. He couldn't immediately identify it. It was not a sound. It was more like a texture change in the air, a density that hadn't been there an hour before. He stood in the doorway and he listened. And then he heard it. Breathing. Slow, even breathing coming from behind Tolliver's bedroom door, which was closed. Cashin stood absolutely still. He told Pharaoh later that his entire body seemed to make a decision before his brain caught up. Every muscle went rigid. His heartbeat went to his throat. Because Tolliver was not supposed to be home. Tolliver had left for work. He had seen him go. He went back to the kitchen. He picked up his phone. He called the building manager and asked if the main door had logged any entries since 9 in the morning, because the building had a key fob entry system. The building manager checked and told him that yes, a fob associated with Tolliver's unit had been used at the main door at 11:42 in the morning. Tolliver had come back, and he had not knocked on Cashin's door. He had not called out. He had come into the apartment while Cashin was sitting 20 feet away in the kitchen and had gone directly and silently to his room. Why? Why would someone come home in the middle of the workday, enter an apartment they shared with someone, and go directly to their room in complete silence without acknowledging that person at all? Here is a possible answer, and this is speculation, I want to be clear about that, but it is speculation informed by the behavior patterns that followed. What if Tolliver hadn't known Cashin was there? What if he had come home expecting an empty apartment and had been startled, and rather than acknowledging the situation, had simply gone to his room and waited? But waited for what? The answer to that question came 3 weeks later, and it came in a form that Cashin still describes with a specific kind of controlled calm that people sometimes use when they are describing something they have processed many times but have never fully made peace with. Cashin's ex-partner, with whom things had ended badly, had a habit of leaving voicemails when he was upset rather than texts, because he felt voicemails were harder to ignore. One evening in late March, Cashin came home to find a voicemail on his phone from his ex. He listened to it in his bedroom with the door closed. He sat on his bed and had the kind of raw, honest, unguarded emotional reaction that you only have when you believe no one can see or hear you. He cried. He talked out loud to himself, the way people sometimes do when they're processing something hard. He said things he would not have said in front of another person. 2 days later, Cashin was in the kitchen when Tolliver came in, poured a glass of water, and said, without looking at him, that it sounded like things with your ex are still pretty bad. Cashin turned slowly and looked at him. He said, "What?" And Tolliver said, calm and neutral as ever, "The walls are thin." And he went back to his room. The walls were thin. Now Cashin began to think back. He thought back to the phone call with his mother. He thought back to every conversation he had had in his bedroom with the door closed. He thought about the night in early March when he had talked on the phone with Pharaoh for almost an hour about how isolated he'd been feeling, the specific details of his separation, his financial stress, his fears about the new job. He thought about all the private, unguarded conversations he had had while believing he was alone. And he thought about a man on the other side of a thin wall who had been listening, collecting. He brought this to Pharaoh the next day. Pharaoh's reaction was immediate. He said, "You need to find out who this guy actually is." They started looking. It took less time than either of them expected. Tolliver had been in the building for a year, as the management company had said. Before that, he had lived in another apartment in the same city, a smaller unit in a building closer to downtown. And before that, Cashin found a social media profile so sparse and carefully curated that it was itself a kind of flag. No personal photographs. No posts tagging friends or locations. A single profile photo of a landscape, no people in it. And in the friend list, which was small and seemed to have been partly restricted, Cashin noticed a comment from a woman that had been left about 2 years earlier and not deleted. The comment said, simply, "Please stop contacting me." He dug further. He found, through a combination of a background check service and public court records, that Tolliver had been the subject of a civil harassment restraining order filed by a previous neighbor in a building he had lived in 3 years earlier. The records were limited in what they disclosed, but they were there. A filing. A granted order. A period of time during which Tolliver had been legally prohibited from contacting or approaching a specific individual. A neighbor. Not a stranger. Someone he had lived near. Cashin and Pharaoh sat with that information for a long evening. They talked about what it meant. They talked about what it explained. And Pharaoh asked the question that had been building since the beginning. He said, "Cashin, what do you think he actually wanted? Not from your food. Not from listening to your calls. What does a person like that actually want from someone they're watching?" And Cashin said, "I think he wanted to know me. Entirely. In a way I hadn't agreed to. In a way I didn't know was happening." There is a term used in clinical literature for a specific kind of intrusive fixation that develops in shared living situations. It is related to but distinct from conventional stalking because of the physical proximity and the domestic context. Some researchers refer to it as intimate territorial obsession, a pattern where one individual becomes profoundly focused on monitoring, collecting information about, and in some cases subtly influencing the daily life of a person they cohabit with, without that person's knowledge or consent. The motivation is not always malicious in a conventional criminal sense. Sometimes it is rooted in a profound dysfunction around intimacy and control, a need to possess knowledge about another person as a substitute for the genuine human connection the individual cannot form, which does not make it less dangerous. In fact, several researchers argue it makes it more so, because the behavior can escalate sharply when the subject begins to pull away. When Cashin gave notice on the lease 2 weeks later, Tolliver did not react visibly. He did not argue. He did not confront. He simply nodded and said, "Okay," and went to his room. But Cashin slept with his bedroom door locked and a chair under the knob for every one of his remaining 14 nights in that apartment. And every single night, at some point in the small hours, he heard Tolliver in the hallway. Not doing anything. Not knocking. Just there. Just standing outside a closed door in the dark and doing whatever it is people like Tolliver do when they stand outside closed doors in the dark at 3 in the morning. When Cashin moved out, he hired 2 friends to help so he was never alone in the apartment. He moved quickly. He did not say goodbye. He left while Tolliver was in his room with the door closed, listening, probably, to the sounds of him leaving, to the sounds of him taking himself away from the proximity that had been so carefully and patiently arranged. He blocked every possible avenue of contact afterward. He never heard from Tolliver directly. But about 6 months later, he ran into the building manager at a grocery store, and the manager mentioned, almost as an aside, that the apartment was back on the market. That Tolliver had given notice the week after Cashin moved out. That he had relocated, the manager assumed, to another part of the city, to another apartment, with, presumably, another roommate. And that is the thought that I want you to carry with you into the third story, because it is the thought that links all 3 of these accounts into something larger than individual horror. The thought that these people, these Delphines and Tollivers, do not stop. They do not conclude. They do not resolve. They move. They find new listings, new housing boards, new leases. They sit across from new people in new cafes and answer questions about parking and laundry schedules and smile their specific smiles and wait for the door to close. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you truly vetted someone before letting them into your living space? Not a quick look at social media. Not a gut feeling over coffee. A real search. Court records. Previous addresses. References you actually called. Because the people in these stories were not selected at random. They were selected from the pool of people who didn't look. Who trusted the listing. Who trusted the handshake. Who trusted the specific and practiced performance of normalcy that people like Delphine and Tolliver have refined over years of repetition. Because here's a fact that researchers in housing safety have documented and that rarely makes it into mainstream conversation. A significant portion of the individuals involved in serious domestic harassment and cohabitation-based crimes have prior patterns that are discoverable through public records and community reporting platforms. Discoverable. Already there. Already visible to anyone who looks hard enough and knows where to look. The barrier is not information availability. The barrier is the assumption that looking is unnecessary. That the person across the coffee table is who they appear to be. That your instincts, which are already quietly registering something slightly off, slightly too still, slightly too focused on you, are not to be trusted. Trust your instincts. That is not a platitude. That is a survival instruction grounded in behavioral science. The human threat detection system is extraordinarily sophisticated and extraordinarily easy to override with social pressure, self-doubt, and the powerful desire not to be the person who makes things awkward by saying something. Say something. The third story is the one that I've spent the most time thinking about. Not because it is the most dramatic, though it is dramatic. Not because it ends the worst, though in some ways it does. But because of the specific quality of the fear at its center. A quality that I find, when I sit with it, more profoundly disturbing than any of the specific events I'm about to describe. Because the fear at the center of the third story is not the fear of being watched, or the fear of being known without consent, or even the fear of what someone might do in the dark hours when you are most vulnerable. The fear at the center of the third story is the fear of not being believed. And that fear, I would argue, is the most universal fear in this entire conversation. Because all of us have had the experience of knowing something is wrong and being unable to make another person see it. All of us have stood in the cold clarity of our own perception and been told, gently or not so gently, that we were imagining things, that we were being dramatic, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation, that we were stressed or tired or projecting or simply wrong. The woman in this story was told all of those things. 4 months. By multiple people she trusted. And she was not wrong. Her name was Veritas. She was 34 years old, a nurse working rotating shifts at a regional hospital in the mid-Atlantic South, a landscape of kudzu-covered hills and long summer nights that smelled of pine and humidity and something ancient underneath both. She was pragmatic, experienced, not easily rattled. 12 years in emergency care will do that to a person. She had seen things that would have broken someone more fragile, and she had processed them and come back to work the next shift with steady hands. She was the kind of person who ran toward the emergency rather than away from it, which is exactly why what happened to her was so effective in its slowness. Because she was not the kind of person who could be frightened quickly. So she was frightened slowly. Her roommate was a man named Prentice, which is the name she gave when she first told this story to a coworker and which, for our purposes, we'll use here. He was 41 years old, or so he said, a freelance contractor who worked in home renovation and whose schedule, like Veritas's, was irregular and unpredictable. He had found the room in her house through a mutual contact, a friend of a friend who had vouched for him as solid and reliable and looking for a stable situation while he completed a long-term project in the area. Veridis had a spare bedroom in the house she owned and was looking to offset her mortgage with rental income, and the mutual contact was someone she trusted. She didn't do a background check. She did not call additional references. She trusted the vouching, and she trusted her own read of the man who came to see the room on a Saturday afternoon, polite and quietly confident and apparently genuinely appreciative of the space. He moved in on a Sunday in June. The summer was largely uneventful. Prentice was easy to live with on the surface. He was clean and paid rent on time and kept the kitchen in good order. He was a better cook than she was, something she found herself enjoying, the smell of something real being made in the evenings when she came home from long shifts. He was interested in her work without being intrusive about it, asking questions about what emergency nursing actually looked like in practice, what the most common cases were, what she found hardest about the job. She found herself, over the early weeks of that summer, genuinely enjoying his company in a low-key domestic way. He was good at being pleasant company. Truly good at it. Later she would recognize this as the skill it was. The first thing she noticed, in late July, was that Prentice sometimes wasn't where she expected him to be. She would come home after a night shift at 6 in the morning, moving quietly through the house the way you do when you've been working through the night and every movement feels slightly unreal, and she would pass Prentice's room and the door would be open and the room would be empty. His truck would be in the driveway. But he wouldn't be in his room, and he wouldn't be in the kitchen or the living room or anywhere she could immediately identify. Then, a minute or two later, he would appear from somewhere, calmly, naturally, like he'd been there all along. The back porch, maybe. Or the hall bathroom. Or the laundry room. Always a reasonable somewhere. Always somewhere she could accept without question. She started noticing it in the other direction, too. Times when she had been in the house for an hour without being aware of him at all, a silence that felt like the house was empty, and then she would walk into the kitchen or down the hall and he would be there. Not emerging from somewhere. Already there. Like he had been there the whole time, perfectly still. She mentioned it to a colleague, the co-worker she would eventually confide everything to, a woman named Retta who had worked with her for 6 years and who she trusted as much as she trusted anyone. Retta's reaction was measured and kind. She said, "You're doing split shifts and you're not sleeping right, V. You're probably just missing each other's movements. The house is probably just doing that thing houses do." Veridis nodded. She went home and she thought about it, and she decided Retta was probably right. But then Prentice said something in August that she has never been able to explain away regardless of how many reasonable interpretations she has attempted. She had been on a phone call with her sister, in her bedroom, door shut, discussing some family business that was stressful and private. Medical decisions about an aging parent. Nothing she would have shared with someone she had known for 2 months. When she came out of her room afterward, Prentice was in the kitchen, and without looking up from what he was doing he said, "I hope your dad's situation works out. I know that kind of thing is hard." Veridis stopped walking. She said, "What?" He said, "You mentioned your dad a while back. Seemed like something was going on. I hope it resolves okay." She had not mentioned her dad to him. Not once. Not in any conversation she could recall. She searched her memory with the thoroughness of a person trained to take accurate histories under pressure, and she could find no instance of mentioning her father's health to Prentice. She said, "I don't think I ever told you about that." He looked up then, and he smiled, and he said, "Sure you did. Early on, when we were talking one evening. You brought it up. You might not remember." And then he went back to what he was doing. She called Retta that night from her car, sitting in the driveway in the dark, not wanting to talk inside the house. She described the exchange. Retta listened carefully and then said, "Veridis, is it possible you did mention it and just don't remember? You've had a rough summer and you've been exhausted. Memory consolidation suffers when you're not sleeping." Veridis said yes. She said it was possible. She got out of the car and went inside, and she told herself it was possible. She started paying closer attention to the house. She was a nurse. She was used to observation. She knew how to watch without appearing to watch, how to take in an environment comprehensively without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing it. She started making small, careful inventories of her space, noting the position of things, noting what she had said and where she had said it, and whether it later appeared in Prentice's knowledge base without a source she could identify. She kept a mental log, then a written one, hidden at the back of a filing cabinet in her home office where she kept her professional records. Over 6 weeks of careful observation, she documented 9 instances of Prentice knowing something he should not have known. Things she had only discussed on private phone calls in her bedroom. Things she had thought about and not said aloud at all. A decision she'd been turning over privately about changing her schedule. A concern she had about a financial matter. A detail about her sister's relationship that she had processed in the solitude of her own thoughts and then, apparently, mentioned in some form to Retta on the phone from her bedroom, because Prentice referenced it 2 days later with the smoothness of someone who had been present for the original conversation. She also documented 3 instances of entering rooms to find things slightly different from how she had left them. Not dramatically. Always within the range of things she could potentially have done herself and forgotten. But 3 instances documented over 6 weeks, combined with the 9 knowledge anomalies, combined with the presence question, the question of where exactly Prentice was in the house at any given time, began to form a picture that her nurse's brain assembled with the clinical precision she had developed over 12 years. Something was wrong with the physical architecture of the situation. Something was allowing Prentice access to information and physical space that should not have been accessible to him. She talked to Retta. Again, Retta was kind and gentle and gently skeptical. She suggested that Veridis might be experiencing a stress response that was manifesting as hypervigilance. She pointed out that the nursing profession had very high rates of anxiety and occupational burnout, and that the symptoms Veridis was describing, the heightened threat perception, the feeling of being monitored, the intrusive sense of someone knowing too much, were consistent with burnout-related anxiety presentations. She said, and she said it with love, "V, I think you need to talk to someone. A professional someone." Veridis went home. She sat in her kitchen. She thought about Retta's words with the fairness of a person who genuinely considers that she might be wrong. And then she got up and she walked slowly through every room of her house and she looked at the walls. Her house was an older property. 1940s construction. The kind of house that had been renovated multiple times over its 70-plus-year life and that carried the evidence of each renovation in its layers. Prentice worked in home renovation. This had been, when they met, simply a fact about his occupation. It was now a fact with a different texture. She looked at the walls. She looked particularly at the wall between her bedroom and the hallway. And she noticed, partially hidden behind a bookshelf she had never had reason to move, a spot in the lower portion of the wall where the drywall looked subtly different. Newer. The paint was not quite the same shade. The texture was slightly smoother. She moved the bookshelf. She got down on her knees. And she found what Prentice had put there. It was small. Barely the size of a thumbnail. A small, discreet opening in the drywall, professionally finished around the edges to minimize visibility, that connected, she would later confirm with the help of a contractor she hired specifically for this purpose, to the interior wall cavity that ran between her bedroom and the hallway, into which something could be placed. Something small. Something with a microphone. She called the police. Not the non-emergency line. She called the emergency line because by the time she was down on her knees looking at that wall, she was shaking in a way she had never shaken, not in 12 years of emergency medicine, and she understood with her whole body that Prentice was in the house. He was in his room, and when the police arrived and knocked on his door, he answered in the same calm, collected way he had answered everything for the entire duration of his time in her house. He was cooperative. He was polite. He expressed confusion. He suggested that Veritas had been under a lot of stress and perhaps had not examined the wall carefully enough. The police examined the wall. They found a small device. A wireless audio transmitter, commercially available, marketed for purposes of home monitoring, that had been installed inside the wall cavity between the bedroom and the hallway at a point that would have required access to the inside of the wall. Access that, for an ordinary person, would be inexplicable. Access that, for a home renovation contractor who had been living in the house for 3 months and who had on multiple occasions offered helpfully to handle minor household repairs, was not inexplicable at all. Prentice was removed from the house that night. The device was collected as evidence. The case went through a legal process that resulted in charges being filed and a protective order being issued. Veritas's lawyer told her afterward that the charges would have been stronger had they been able to identify what recordings, if any, had been made and transmitted. That determination required digital forensics that moved at a pace that felt, to Veritas, inadequate to the violation she had experienced. What stayed with her, more than the device in the wall, more than the legal process, more than the months of making sure every lock and every entry point in her house was changed and secured, was something that happened in the days immediately following. Retta came to her house. Veritas showed her the repair work the contractor had done to fill and properly seal the wall cavity. She showed her the photographs she had taken before the contractor arrived, photographs the police had also documented. And Retta sat with those photographs for a long time and then said something that Veritas described to me as both the most comforting and the most painful thing she heard during the entire experience. Retta said, "I should have believed you." And Veritas said, "Yes, you should have." Because here is the thing that doesn't get talked about enough in these conversations. The fear of the predator is real. The fear of the invasion is real. The fear of lying in your bed at night not knowing who is listening is real, and it is profound, and it leaves marks that don't fully fade. But layered underneath all of that, woven into the experience of every person who has ever tried to report something like this and been met with gentle skepticism, is a secondary wound that is sometimes harder to heal than the primary one. The wound of being doubted by the people you trusted to believe you. Delphine's former roommate on the housing forum had posted her account and partly deleted it, possibly because of the responses she received. Cashin had been told by Pharaoh, a good and well-meaning friend, that he was projecting his anxiety. Veritas had been told by Retta, a kind and intelligent colleague, that she was experiencing burnout. All of them had been offered an alternative explanation for their experience, and all of them had been invited, kindly and with genuine concern, to doubt themselves. And because the people offering that invitation were people they trusted and cared for, they had all, for a time, accepted the invitation. They had all spent weeks or months living inside a doubt that the person on the other side of their wall had created and that the people they loved had inadvertently deepened. This is what I want you to remember. Not as a caveat or a comfort, but as a fact about reality that is important enough to carry with you. When someone you trust tells you that you are imagining something, they may be right. Human perception is fallible. Anxiety distorts. Exhaustion colors. These things are real. But they are not the whole story. And the history of exactly these kinds of situations is full of people who were told they were imagining things right up to the moment that it became impossible to deny that they were not. The pattern across all three of these stories is not random. That's the piece I keep returning to when I sit with them together. The pattern is coherent and documented and, in the view of researchers who study cohabitation-based threat behavior, predictable in its early stages if you know what to look for. It starts with something small and easily explained. An object in the wrong place. A yogurt that may or may not have been yours. A comment that could have come from a conversation you don't remember having. Something that triggers a mild, manageable question in your mind and that you answer, reasonably, with the most comfortable available explanation. Then it continues. And continues. Each individual instance remaining within the range of the explainable, but the accumulation, the weight of all of them together, beginning to register somewhere beneath conscious analysis. In the body, often. in the specific quality of the sleep you're getting, in the way you move through your own shared space, in the small unconscious adjustments you begin making without knowing why. You start sleeping with your door locked without having a clear conversation with yourself about why you started doing that. You start taking your phone into your bedroom and charging it there instead of in the kitchen without making a deliberate decision to do so. You start paying attention to sounds you used to filter out. You start knowing, in some wordless way, where the other person in the apartment is at any given time, even through walls, even without seeing them. Your threat detection system has registered something that your conscious mind is still arguing with. And if you're lucky, if you are the kind of lucky that Mireille, Cashin, and Veridis were, which is the limited and bruising kind of lucky that involves real damage before the real danger is averted, you listen to it eventually. You listen to the part of you that knows before your brain has finished explaining why. There is a theory that some researchers in forensic behavioral science have put forward, and I want to emphasize that this is a theoretical framework and not a universally accepted clinical model, but it is compelling enough that I think it's worth sharing. The theory suggests that certain individuals who engage in cohabitation-based stalking and surveillance behavior are not primarily motivated by hostility toward the person they are fixating on. They are motivated by what the researchers describe as a compulsive need for total knowledge of another person's intimate life. A need so consuming that it overrides normal social boundaries, ethical constraints, and even self-preservation instinct, because individuals engaging in this behavior often do so in ways that risk their own exposure and social destruction. The theory goes further. It suggests that the target is often chosen not randomly but for specific qualities. Qualities like self-sufficiency, intelligence, emotional groundedness. The kind of person who, paradoxically, is less likely to be believed when they report something, because the qualities that make them appear competent and together also make their distress look, to outside observers, like overreaction. Veridis was a nurse with 12 years of emergency experience. Of course she was under stress. Of course she was tired. Of course. Cashin had just gone through a painful separation. Of course he was anxious. Of course. Mireille was a high-achieving graduate student carrying a heavy academic load in a new city. Of course. Of course is a very useful tool when you need to make someone doubt the most accurate perceptions of their own life. The question that I think about, and the one I'll leave you with, is this. We have increasingly sophisticated tools for monitoring our homes from the outside. Cameras on doorways. Smart locks that log entry times. Motion sensors connected to our phones. We have built, collectively, an extensive technological infrastructure designed to tell us when something outside our door is approaching. And all of that is useful. All of that has its place. But none of it addresses the specific and terrifying vulnerability that these three stories illuminate. The vulnerability that exists not at the threshold but well past it. In the room next door. In the shared hallway. In the wall between the place where you sleep and the place where someone else has been given the legal and physical right to exist. No smart lock tells you what is happening behind a closed door you share a lease with. No doorbell camera shows you what is in the space above a bathroom ceiling tile. No security system accounts for the person who already has the code. So what do you do with that? You start, I think, by being less comfortable with discomfort. By being less willing to accept the first available reasonable explanation for the thing that doesn't feel right. By having the conversation that feels awkward earlier rather than later, before the discomfort has accumulated into something with roots. By being the person who asks the question that might make things briefly uncomfortable, because briefly uncomfortable is infinitely preferable to what comes after the long silence. You look. You actually look. Before someone moves into your space, before you move into theirs. Court records are publicly searchable in most jurisdictions. Prior addresses can be checked. References can be called and asked genuine questions rather than the softball questions we tend to ask because we don't want to seem paranoid or rude. The information is often already there. It is already visible. It requires only the willingness to look for it. And perhaps most importantly, you listen to yourself. You listen to the part of you that wakes at 3 in the morning and goes very still. You listen to the part of you that notices the smile that lasts a fraction of a second too long. You listen to the part of you that keeps the tally of all the small things that are supposed to be nothing, that adds them up and comes to a number that your conscious mind keeps erasing. That part of you is not broken. That part of you is not anxious or paranoid or projecting. That part of you has access to information that your rational mind has not yet fully assembled, and it is trying, with the urgency of something that understands the stakes better than you do, to get your attention. Mireille listened on the night she found the journal. Cashin listened after the Friday afternoon of the locked door and the breathing. Veridis listened when she moved the bookshelf and got down on her knees and looked at the wall. All of them listened eventually. All of them got out. All of them are okay. And all of them will tell you the same thing when asked what they would have done differently. They would have listened sooner. There's one last thing I want to tell you before I let you go. One last piece of information that I have been sitting with since I first researched these accounts, and that I think is important enough to share even though, or maybe especially because, it is uncomfortable. All 3 of the individuals I've described in this episode were eventually asked by investigators or legal representatives whether, in retrospect, there had been a moment early on. Not a dramatic moment. Not an event. But a moment. A single early perception, a feeling, an observation, a half-registered thought, in which they had known or suspected that something was not quite right. All 3 of them said yes. All 3 of them said that there had been something early on, something small and easily explainable, that they had noticed and chosen, for 100 entirely understandable reasons, not to take seriously. For Mireille, it was the first meeting. The coffee shop. The eye contact that lasted just a second too long. She had thought, in the cab home, that Delphine was a little intense. She had overridden it with the observation that intelligent people often were. For Cashin, it was the parking lot handshake. The specific quality of Tolliver's stillness. He had noticed it and labeled it calm, because calm was a comfortable label and still was a label that asked more questions. For Veridis, it was something Prentice had said during the room viewing. Something small. He had looked around her house, her home, the place where she had lived alone and made entirely her own, and he had said, with a smile that she later described as slightly too appreciative, "This is exactly what I was looking for." And she had taken it as a compliment about the room. And maybe it was. But she had noticed, somewhere beneath the surface of the social moment, that his eyes had moved through the house in a particular way. Slowly, comprehensively, like he was memorizing the layout, like he was planning to know it very well. She overrode it. She showed him the room. She told him the rent. She signed the paperwork. And then, because there are always more stories, and because the people who do these things do not stop and do not resolve and do not retire quietly into some contained and harmless existence, somewhere right now in a college town or an industrial city or a house with an older wall full of secrets, someone is signing paperwork. Someone is offering a handshake with a specific quality of stillness. Someone is maintaining eye contact 1 second too long. Someone is saying, "This is exactly what I was looking for." And the person across from them is noticing, somewhere small and quiet and beneath the noise of ordinary social life, that something is slightly off. The only question is what they do next. Lock your door tonight. Not because I've told you that you should be afraid of the person on the other side of it, but because you already know whether you should be. And you should trust that knowing more than you trust the voice that says you're probably just imagining things. You've been with me through 3 of the most haunting, most real, and most quietly terrifying accounts of what can happen when the threat isn't outside the door. When it's already inside, already breathing, already watching, already smiling its specific smile across the breakfast table. Stay curious. Stay careful. And if something in your living situation is making the back of your neck cold in a way you can't explain, don't explain it away. Listen to the cold.